All right, guys, we are going to go through some test one review material for you that's going to really help you with this test. This information I thought would be the most useful because it's either the most complicated or it's the most covered information on the test. So the first thing you want to know about are the two examples of self-government that we talked about. And self-government was where the colonies had some type of independence from the British, and they were allowed to rule themselves. So in the Chesapeake or in Jamestown, that example would be the House of Burgess. And then in New England, that example would be the Mayflower Compact. Now, these are two different things. The House of Burgess was an actual organization. It was elected members. So you got to choose who the members of this House of Burgess were. But there was a limitation, and that limitation was that this House of Burgess was overseen by the governor who was appointed by the King of Great Britain. So the guy who was actually in charge of the House of Burgess or was overseeing it was kind of like the supervisor from the king. The Mayflower Compact is the governing document of the Plymouth colony. And this established a whole system of self-government. That included town hall meetings, and that means that New England had way more self-government than the Chesapeake. In the Chesapeake, really all they had were the House of Burgess. New England is going to pretty much be all self-governing colonies. That includes Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, Rhode Island. They had some kingship looking over them, but really they were mostly independent. So because of that, New England had more self-government. Now, the thing about self-government is it's complex. You need to understand the complexity for some of the harder questions. So New England is going to be very, very self-governed until King James. King James is going to come in and he's going to take away a lot of the self-government of New England, make all New England colonies one mega colony, and that mega colony is going to be called the Dominion of New England. So the Dominion of New England is how King James challenged this. Now, he only stayed around for a couple of years, so because of that, this Dominion only stayed around for a couple of years, but that was how he challenged it. The most complex things that you need to understand is the relationship between the Navigation Acts, mercantilism, and salutary neglect. If you can understand these concepts, I think that you're going to understand the hardest questions on the test. So the Navigation Acts forced the colonies to only trade with the British. Now, how that relates to mercantilism is because mercantilism was this idea that the British wanted to make a ton of money off the colonies so that they could gain more power and then eventually gain more colonies. So they thought money equals power, power equals more control of more parts of the country or more parts of the world. The British at this point are basically trying to take over a lot of the world. The Navigation Acts was how they were going to make all of this money off the colonies because they were going to force the colonies to sell their products to only the British. Now, the thing is, the colonists didn't like this because what if somebody was offering them a better price than the British, which a lot of times they were. So because of that, the colonies would smuggle around this. And the British saw that the colonists were smuggling around it, but they didn't want to come down too harshly on the colonies. And because of that, they allowed for the British, or they allowed for the colonies to smuggle around as long as the British were still making a lot of money. I kind of look at this a little bit like a gangster movie. The British, they're the gang leader. As long as they're getting their money, if the colonies were doing a little bit of something on the side to make money themselves, the British didn't really care. And that's called salutary neglect. So salutary neglect kind of supports this idea of self-government or self-regulation of the colonies, whereas the Navigation Acts and mercantilism work against that idea. All right, now the different societies. Most of your questions when it comes to the different societies established are going to be asking you to compare New England and the Chesapeake. That includes an essay that you're going to be writing later this week. And the reason why is because both of these areas are going to be heavily populated from people from Great Britain. But the colonies turned out so differently. And because of that, historians have always been loving to study, like, why did these colonies that basically were made up of the same people turn out so differently? So New England is going to have way more families. So when it comes to the characteristics of the people there, they're going to be way more family oriented. The Chesapeake is largely males, and that's because they're trying to make money. All right. So since there's more families, another characteristic of New England is that they lived in towns. All right. And they had towns so they could have schools and town hall meetings. The Chesapeake, they were really, really spread out. So their towns were few and far between. They had these large plantation fields. So ultimately, education is going to be way more important in New England than it is going to be in the Chesapeake. Okay. When it comes to the purpose, you need to understand that the purpose of New England originally was for religious freedom. If you remember the Puritans and the Pilgrims, Puritans founded Massachusetts Bay Colony, the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony. They wanted to establish new churches away from the British. And that's where John Winthrop comes in. John Winthrop, you need to know who he is. Very important guy. He was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he basically ran a theocracy. What that means is that his governing doctrine, the government, was tied to the church. One example of it being tied to the church is that town hall meetings were held in churches and could only be attended if you were a church member. The main purpose for the Chesapeake colonies is going to be to make money. And if you remember the Virginia Company, the whole reason why the Virginia Company was founded was because they were trying to make money. Now, it failed. This company failed mainly because they thought that there would be a lot of gold in Virginia, and there wasn't. But the major way that the Chesapeake is going to make their money is through tobacco. All right. The environment plays a huge role on this test, and that's because the environment really set up a lot of the societies that we've talked about. So let me just run through some of the examples. First main example is maize. This is corn. That caused for people, Native Americans, to be stationary as opposed to being nomadic. The Pueblos, remember, they're the Southwest Native Americans, so they lived kind of in the desert. They built houses into the rock due to heat. The Great Plains, that's where the buffalo were. They had teepees because they had to have high mobility teepees you can set up and tear down very easily so they could be on the move constantly hunting buffalo. The Northeast, they developed the Iroquois Confederacy because they were stationary. Again, that goes back to this maize. But they had to develop relationships with their neighbors because they were stationary, which is why they developed the Iroquois Confederacy. You need to know both parts of that. And then the southern colonies, or the Chesapeake, it was hot and humid. So because of that, they could grow their tobacco. Right? You need to understand that it's hot and humid there. So it's not like they didn't, well, I'll explain that more in a second. New England, it was cold. They had rocky soil, so they couldn't grow crops. So it's not like New England thought that crops were beneath them. They didn't think that. They would love to have grown tobacco as well to make some of that money. They literally couldn't because of their environment. And so because of that, they had to rely on trading instead. All right, now you need to know about the Native American relationships. So New England and the Chesapeake, or Jamestown, one thing that is similar about them is that they had bad relationships with Native Americans, okay? The Pequot Wars and the King Philip's War are both going to be New England fights. The Pequot War, that's where there was a village burned to the ground. Lots of people died. And William Bradford, who's this famous Puritan, actually said that this was like a sign that God wanted this to happen. So there were some ideas that these wars were somewhat holy. King Philip's War, that was Metacom, he got all these Native Americans together to fight against the British. This was a massive war. King Philip's War is the biggest Native American war in the colonies. It's also the last time that the Native Americans fought the New England settlers. After Metacom's killed, the Native Americans basically move or they submit to a lot of the will of the New England settlers. Jamestown and the Chesapeake, their major Native American opponent was Powhatan. Now, Powhatan, their wars were basically about land, and that's where Bacon's Rebellion comes in. I have these question marks. It's like, well, wait, how does Bacon's Rebellion relate to Native American wars? If you remember, Bacon's Rebellion was started because a lot of these poor former indentured servants moved out to the frontier. And when they moved far, far away from the town, the land that they were taking was Native American land. So they wanted to fight the Native Americans. And some of the House of Burgess did not want that. And because of that, that's why they rebelled. Now, the Middle and French colonies, they're pretty easy because they're friends. So because of that, they traded with the Native Americans. It's not like they didn't have any conflict, but it was very rare. And so it's easy to remember that Middle French friends, and that was for trade. And the major thing that they were trading was fur. The last is the Spanish. Now, the Spanish had bad conflict with them as well. If I was ranking them, though, I would tell you that New England and Jamestown had worse relationships than the Spanish, even though the Spanish did this thing called the encomienda system. This is where they put Native Americans in kind of this hybrid of slavery. They felt like since they were Christianizing Native Americans, that Native Americans should kind of work for them. And they didn't like that. Native Americans didn't like that. So that led to Pueblo's Revolt, 1680. And in Pueblo's Revolt, they kicked the Spanish out. The Spanish came back 12 years later, but it got rid of the encomienda system for the Pueblos. All right, there are 3 skills that I'm going to be looking for that we've talked about this unit. The first is a thesis creation. Remember, your thesis would be your argument plus some of your evidence or reasoning in one statement. So for a practice, you might have a prompt that says, evaluate the similarities and differences between the Spanish and English colonies. So if I was to write out a thesis for that, I would say, although the Spanish and English had similar experiences with Native Americans, or they were both bad, their overall purpose and establishment of the colonies were very different. So since I'm having to evaluate the similarities and differences, I put something that's similar, I put something that's different, I make sure that it's concrete, so I was not vague. I did not say the Spanish and English had some similarities and some differences. I spelled out exactly what I thought my similarities and differences would be. So I said similar, those Native Americans, purpose and establishment for the colonies was very different. And you would not have to do this part, but just so you can kind of have a little bit of a review. Remember, I said the similar experiences, I would talk about bad things that both the Spanish and English did. So if I was to write paragraphs after this, I would write about the encomienda system and King Philip's War. And then if I was to write about differences, you could talk about there was gold extraction. Lots of gold was collected by the Spanish, and the king had heavy control over all the colonies in Spain, and the Spanish colonies. Whereas there was all these different levels of control. You had some private colonies, you had king-controlled colonies or the royal colonies, and then you even had New England doing a lot of their own self-government. And their religions were going to be different. England was Protestant, Spain was Catholic. And then there's also like growing plants. The Spanish never really did a lot of crop cultivation, whereas England did grow a lot of crops, remember, tobacco. So that's what I would have talked about. But all you are going to be asked to do really is to give me a thesis and then some defense of that thesis, but you'll have to write it out in sentence form. So you now have a practice. So you'll want to do your practice. It says, what caused for the colonies to begin to resent the government, the British government? So remember, this says caused. So you have to make sure that your thesis is explaining the causes for what caused for the colonies to begin to resent the British. All right. The second thing you're going to need is to be able to do document analysis. This is the answer and explain. All right. So you're explaining or summarizing the document, and then you're answering the prompt. So it should be 2 sentences. Sometimes this is going to feel repetitive, but most of the time, you're going to want your summary to be pretty broad, just to make sure you're talking about the theme of what the document's covering, and then you get more specific with your answer. So I have this prompt right here. You'll want to make sure you read the prompt first before the document. It says evaluate why the Chesapeake colonies were different from the New England colonies. And then here's the document. If I were you, I would pause this really quickly and I would try to kind of figure out what this document's saying so you can have a little bit of practice beforehand. All right. If you go to, if you read through the document, then what you should have seen is this major thing is talking about is the difference in the sex ratio between males and females in New England compared to the Chesapeake. So, and the Chesapeake, and we've talked about this in class as well, there were not a lot of women compared to the fact that there were lots of women in the northern colonies. And they made this conclusion, such a high proportion of females in the population assured young men of New England greater success than their southern counterparts in finding spouses. So my summary would be the document is describing the gender ratio between New England and the Chesapeake. There are a lot more women in New England than in the Chesapeake. All right, so that's all I'm doing, but I need to evaluate why the Chesapeake colonies were actually different, and I don't really do that here. So my answer, I get more specific. I spell it out for my audience. Because there were more women in New England, the men would be more likely to stay there compared to the Chesapeake and start a family. This would lead to more investment in the community and create institutions such as schools much faster in New England than in the Chesapeake, which would lead to them being different. So I connect the idea of starting family to schools, which isn't directly talked about in the document, but I know that this is true from my notes. So this is going to usually require you to know some outside information and use that to explain as well. Okay, and then you have your practice as well. It says evaluate how Native Americans changed with the introduction of European settlers. All right, your last thing that you'll need to be able to do is an SAQ, which is where you answer, cite, explain, or expand. So answer, you give a direct answer to this question. Cite, you give an example that backs up your answer, makes up your answer. And then explain or expand is where you expand on your answer, so you provide more detail to it, or you explain how your example connects to your answer if it doesn't seem like it directly connects. So practice one, briefly explain one important similarity between the goals of the Spanish and English colonies in the Americas prior to the 1700s. So if I were you again, I'd pause it. I would try to answer this so then you can get feedback. The biggest thing that you need is you need to make sure you have 3 sentences. The way you do this, why I focus on you doing an ACE is to make sure you provide enough information, because a lot of times students don't. All right, so my answer would be one of the ways that the Spanish and English were similar was in their pursuit to make money. So both of them wanted to make money. Cite, the Spanish wanted to make money through extracting gold, while the English wanted to make money through the cash crops. Now, again, all I'm saying is that my similarity is that their pursuit was to make money. I didn't say that we're trying to pursue money the same exact way. Right? So for this, I've already kind of explained, I feel like what I need to do now is just go into a little bit of more depth of exactly how they were extracting gold and cash crops. Both of these goals led to conflict with Native Americans. And this is, I kind of do both here just so you can see. To make sure that I'm not actually talking more about a difference than a similarity, I want to make sure I relate it back to something that's similar. So both of these led to conflicts with Native Americans. The English wanted their land to grow the crops. So that's how the English led to conflict based off the cash crops. And the Spanish wanted gold, which led to conflict, like Pueblo's revolt. Even though Pueblo's revolt is really like more directly to the encomienda system, encomienda was kind of tied to gold extraction as well. So you can see a couple things. One, I tie it back to my answer. Number two, Pueblo's revolt is very specific. So you should be somewhat specific. I could have even been more specific here with the English and talked about Powhatan, like specifically, or Bacon's Rebellion specifically. And that would have been a better answer probably than what I put here. So make sure you're specific and make sure you do all three parts. And if you feel like your site is like self-explanatory, then move to expand. And I said at the very beginning, I thought I did more of an expand, and really reading this is much more of an explain. I'm explaining how this ties back to a similarity between the two of them. All right, and then you have your site, or you have your own SAQ that you'll do. And that's it, guys. Good luck studying.